What's up, my wizards? It's Dev, SBMTG, we like magic, and I've got something neat for you today. Usually at this point in the format, I would go ahead and give you a State of Standard video. The format's about to rotate, it's completely slapped full of cards, and at this point I would usually do a top 5 decks in Standard video, you know? But at this point, the top 5 or even 8 decks in Standard are all well established. We've seen them a bunch of times before, you know? How many times can we talk about Ramunap Red or Green Black Constrictor? That's a really old deck. Mono Black Zombie's been around forever. Mardu Vehicles, that's a year and a half old or whatever it is at this point. So the best decks in Standard are well established. They've been established. And even though the format has adjusted to sort of deal with Ramunap Red, a lot of the decks that filled that vacuum, filled that space, are decks that we've seen before. These are just 5 decks that I came across looking through results that really piqued my interest and look really awesome to me. And if you want to finish off the format by playing something other than the usual fare, these are decks that are weird and have proven that they can win. So let's start with number 5. Well, actually, before we jump in, super special thanks to TCG Player for helping bring you this video today. I've got links to all 5 of these decks in the description. Just hit those links, take you right over to TCG Player so you can check out the list. But without further ado, let's take a look at number 5, for realsies this time. And number 5 is a dangerous mono black deck. This actually looks really sick to me. It's got all the best removal in the format and some really awesome threats at like all points of the curve. So let's take a look at Eldrazi Vampires. That's already awesome, by Chris Botello. This took 9th place at the Grand Prix in Minneapolis over the last weekend. A lot of these decks came from the last weekend, just so you know. But let's take a look at this list here at large for just a second before I talk about any individual cards. Well, the makeup of the deck's got 23 creatures, 10 spells, 3 planeswalkers, and 24 lands. That is very similar to the makeup of all of the aggro decks in the format, whether they be Ramunap Red or Green Black Constrictor. Mardu will often play about this split of, you know, different spell types. So as far as the construction of the deck, the theory behind what the deck wants to do, it's fairly similar to a lot of other decks. It's just got specific foils for really Ramunap Red. But if it comes up against decks like Green Black Constrictor that are a little bit higher up the curve, play a little bit bigger threats at the higher end, it can still deal. Well, the first creatures I want to talk about are Gifted Aetherborn and Kalitas. Both of these have become really important against mono red decks and, you know, again, other aggro decks. There's a lot of dedicated aggro in the format, but with as fast as Ramunap Red strikes, it's definitely the lowest to the ground, fastest aggro deck in the format. Gifted Aetherborn is really good on turn 2, helps stave off some of that aggro. And Kalitas can do pretty much the same thing, just on a bigger scale, you know, a 3/4 that gets bigger, and can again blank a creature when it blocks with its lifelink and kill something that it blocks as well. That's important, and the fact that it sends creatures to exile rather than the graveyard. Really important too, you know, you got stuff like Earthshaker Kinra, Scrapheap's Crowner, and a bunch of other stuff in this format that is resilient. It can be embalmed or eternalized or brought back in some other way, you know. We see Lilianas and stuff in this format, so Kalitas is just good in multiple ways against aggro right now. I think he's really a boss. The deck also runs Drana, really like that, against Ramunap Red, and again, even Green-Black variants. This can get through really easily. There's not a whole lot of flying in either one of those decks, and being able to just, almost no questions asked, get your dudes bigger whenever Drana gets in is just an awesome ability, especially with the lifelink in this deck on creatures like, again, Gifted Aetherborn and Kalitas, you know. Being able to pump them up especially is a really, really good deal. But let's look at the Eldrazi in the deck. They're all up in here too. We've got Matter Reshaper and Thought-Knot Seer and Reality Smasher in this deck. Matter Reshaper is great because you're usually going to end up trading it in aggro matchups anyway, and you'll get a card out of it, whereas they will not get anything. Thought-Knot Seer is just always solid, you know, especially when you do run up against the odd control deck in this format. Control decks are a thing. They are like tier 2, just like a lot of the decks we're looking at today. So you will run up against them occasionally, and obviously Thought-Knot, when resolved, is great against them. And all the mid-range strategies. Sometimes against Green-Black, you'll get a Verderus out of their hand. That's pretty sweet. So Thought-Knot Seer is just always a solid creature. And Reality Smasher is actually better against everything than it looks, and it always has been. You know, when resolved against control, it can go ahead and swing in with haste and just like crush for 5. That's awesome. It can easily take out planeswalkers that they thought they had protected, but not necessarily. Not only that, but it's really hard to remove for control decks too, so really a pain for any control decks, and it's not terrible if you get to it against aggro. It can swing as soon as it hits the battlefield, and it tramples over all of their small guys too, so you're almost guaranteed to get damage in. Not only that, but they really have like no real reliable way of removing this. Right now, Collective Brutality does it all in this format, you know. It's good against slower decks, it's good against the smaller decks, because it can easily kill nearly any creature they play, so Collective Brutality is just the dopest thing ever right now. Play it while it's still in the format. Same thing with Grasp of Darkness. Takes out Hazoret, extremely important right now, and Fatal Push takes out everything in every dedicated aggro strategy, almost. So we've got some really, really good removal here. And finally, you know, let's just round it all out with Liliana, yet another thing that can kill nearly everything in Ramunap Red except for like Oncrop and Hazoret. Aside from those, it's pretty much got the lock on like Earthshaker Kinra, Falcon Wrath Gorger, Bomat Courier, Village Messenger, just really solid against a lot of the smaller dudes in the format, and she hits the board pretty early, especially on the play. Fantastic card, and obviously if they do manage to kill our guys, Liliana can easily get them back too. So Liliana is another card that only has like 6 weeks left in this format, but is at her best right now. So let's take a look at the list at large one more time before I finish up talking about this deck. Just looks like a really versatile list, you know. Mono Black usually can't deal with certain things. It has a problem with artifacts, it has a problem with enchantments, but for the most part, again, very, very versatile list, effective against a lot of different strategies people are playing in this format. It's got tools against Control and Collective Brutality, Resolve Reality Smasher, Resolve Thought-Knot Seer, and some pesky stuff on the lower end of the curve. You know, Glint-Sleeve Siphoner can be a problem for Control decks too. So really decent creature base as, you know, just consistent threats against Control, and obviously the deck is tuned to deal with small-time aggro. You know, Gifted Aetherborn, Kalidas, both insane tools. Drana almost always gets through. Once you get to Reality Smasher, it can do a bunch of damage, turn the tide in your favor. 10 different amazing removal spells against small aggro, and Liliana to kill small aggro dudes and get your guys back so you can win in long games. You know, it's just ridiculous amounts of versatility in this deck. It's got a very good game plan. But moving along, my number 4 deck today is arguably the most aggro deck in the format. It definitely plays more creatures than any deck in the format, and it doesn't sacrifice from its creature base too much in order to play like format-specific answers in the aggro mirror. It only plays a few different pieces of removal, but that being said, it's still really well equipped in aggro matchups. So let's take a look at Naya Humans by Daniel Kudkowitz. This took 7th place at the Star City Games Classic just last weekend. Here's the list before we talk about the individual cards. 7th place is not bad, man. Danny Boy top 8'd with this list. And again, look at those creatures. 33 of them and only 4 spells that aren't creatures. Just 4 Braid. And one of my favorite things about this deck is that it plays, yes, a lot of like obviously good creatures, but it also plays a lot of creatures that never really got a shot or haven't seen a whole lot of play yet. So let's look at some of those real quick. First of all, I love the inclusion of both Hamwire Garrison and Heron's Grace Champion, especially here. Hamwire Garrison looks to be pretty good, even in the aggro matchup and against Control. When resolved against Control and left unchecked, it's going to give you a huge board that they're going to have to sweep or die. There's just their only 2 options. Draw a sweeper or you will lose to this steamroll eventually. Hamwire Garrison looks good for that, but it also looks good for like developing a relatively big board against aggro. And Garrison can help you win the race against those decks too. If they're just slamming face and then you're slamming face, you know, they're not going to be able to deal with the pace of you creating 2 extra dudes every single turn, especially when you're boosting them with stuff like Heron's Grace Champion. You know, HGC's job in this deck is also to help us win the race, put us a little farther ahead of them on turn 4. Love that Heron's Grace is in this deck. Always loved this card, and I hate that it took this long to really see some play, but HGC looks specifically very good in the aggro mirror. Thalia is obviously in there against mono red strategies that play all of the haste creatures in the world, and she's got First Strike, which can be really important against that deck too. She kills everything but Hazoret and lives to tell the tale. Even though she's weak to stuff like Shock and Magma Spray, still worth playing against that deck. That's why we're playing a 3 of, by the way, so if she gets shocked or Magma Sprayed, we can easily find another copy. And finally, you know, Hazoret might look weird to some people. I would get that because we got 5 drops like Avacyn in the deck. We've got stuff that draws us cards, you know. We've got Thraben Inspector and Tireless Tracker. But honestly, even if we don't get to attack with Hazoret the turn she comes down, totally fine. This can just give us a reach. We can just pump 3 mana into Hazoret every turn. Eventually, we will be able to swing to her with her. But in the meantime, we're hitting them in the face for 2 to the dome every turn. That kind of reach can be really important. Here's the list in its entirety one more time before I finish up talking about it. I just really, really like the construction of this deck. 33 creatures seems a little bold, especially with no planeswalkers. You'd expect to see Chandra or Gideon in this deck. Maybe it's just not so convinced that it can make, double white or double red on turn 4. I think it probably could make double white, but that's beyond the point. Obviously, the deck doesn't want to do that. It just wants to get its human synergy on as much as possible. I don't blame it for that. The deck looks pretty fierce and resilient to sweepers, too, because it's just got all the creatures. You just got swept. You're probably drawing creatures the next couple of turns anyway. So I really like the base construction here. Really bold deck and some really good answers. If you've got a lot of Ramunap Red at your F&M, this looks like a pretty good tool to combat it for the next few weeks here. But we got to keep it moving. My number 3 deck of the day is, full disclosure, maybe my favorite deck of the day. I really like this thing. So without further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at Grixis Colossus by Carlos Nino. Might be Nino, but I don't see a tilde. Anyway, this took 12th place at a Star City Games Classic last weekend. And honestly, it's a slightly older deck. We have seen Grixis Colossus perform before, but I love that it's back. Now, obviously, there's Metalwork Colossus in the deck, but other big stuff includes the 1 copy of Elder Deep Fiend and 2 Herald of Anguish. I specifically really like Herald of Anguish in this deck. It's decent against control when you can get it down, and you can probably get it down relatively early. There's a lot of artifacts, 24 of them, in this freaking deck, so you can get down a Herald early against control. Much easier to resolve it than you might think. I've played Herald in a few different decks, and it's always awesome when you can actually get it on the battlefield. It punishes literally every kind of deck in the format, kills small dudes really, really easily, flies over for big chunks of damage. Just Herald, I think, was meant to be an important creature in Standard, and I hope that that continues to trend. So, really like that Herald is in here. Elder Deep Fiend, I like that it's a one of, at least throw it in if you've got an extra slot, because every time it comes down, it's going to be super awesome. But obviously the main attraction here is Metalwork Colossus, and free copies of it are not hard at all in this deck. Especially when you've got artifacts like Cultivator's Caravan and Hedron Archive. These can not only, obviously tap to help you get to your Colossus faster, but they also have relatively mid to high casting costs. A Hedron Archive will essentially put you 6 mana towards a Metalwork Colossus. It's crazy. Cultivator's Caravan, 4 mana towards a Metalwork Colossus. Also note the presence of Mirage Mirror. This can awesomely copy Metalwork Colossus, have 2 huge guys out. That's cool. But it can also copy like Herald of Anguish and your opponent's creatures and even artifacts. Mirage Mirror can really do a lot in this format, and it's 3 mana towards a Metalwork. One that I really want to talk about is Sky Sovereign Console Flagship. This has become a really important card in sideboards as of the last week or two since the Pro Tour. Ramunap Red has really taken off. Green-black and other aggro strategies are the norm right now in Standard. We gotta beat them. So Sky Sovereign is a 2 of in most sideboards at this point, but this deck gets to play it in the main deck. It's looking for as many artifacts as it can possibly play, so we might as well go ahead and slot it in to the main, and it's just so incredible in the aggro matchup. Kills a thing when it comes into play, kills a thing whenever it attacks. It's just really fantastic. Just a standout artifact that's going to decrease the cost of Metalwork by an awful lot. When it's not a creature, obviously, that's a plus of it right there. It can improvise for Herald of Anguish, and it's a removal spell, all in one, that can sometimes kill more than one thing a game. Just Sky Sovereign is out of control. The card is very good right now. Here's the list one more time. I like how this deck plays. Like I said, I've played a little bit of Grixis Colossus in the past before, and I love that it's got a bunch of big threats. Colossus can come down for free at nearly any time, especially after you get set up. It can keep coming back against control decks. They got a counterspell for it that doesn't exile it, then you're going to get it back. It's going to give them huge problems. If you can play any of these big guys against, especially Herald of Anguish, against the aggro decks in the format, get to those guys and get a turn or 2 with them, and you're just more or less you're guaranteed to win. You can get a few activations of Herald, you're going to win. And we get to the late game pretty easily in this deck. It's not your standard run-of-the-mill sort of combo artifact deck that's just looking to play Colossus as fast as possible. Yeah, it's trying to do that, but Also sort of plays like a mid-range or control deck. You know, look at all the awesome removal in here. Fatal Push, K-Return, Battle at the Bridge, and Sky Sovereign all kill stuff. And Herald of Anguish for that matter. So we've got a lot of really, really solid removal to cover our early game here. Love the construction of this deck. Love what it's trying to do both in the early game to hold off aggro and in the late game to just really take the game over. But we're on number 2 here. Let's take a look at what I think is the weirdest deck of the day, at least from like a deck building theory point of view. But this is my other favorite deck of the day, probably just for that reason specifically. Here is 4-color Ramp. How neat is that? By Deshad Moore. This came in first place at an IQ from Star City Games just last weekend as well. So you know this deck is good. Feast your eyes on this super weird list before I get into the individual card choices here. Again, just from a deck building theory point of view, this deck is super odd, you know. Look at all the one-ofs, but it does run a toolbox strategy and way more removal than Ramp usually runs. Again, just like the last deck. The decks like this don't usually feature a removal package this detailed, you know. So let's take a look at these cards. As far as ramp targets specifically, we've got Worldbreaker and obviously Ulamog. But both of these can erase permanents forever. That's pretty sweet. And if Ulamog gets in even just a couple of times, it's more or less game over. So I feel like he's definitely got to play one Ulamog. This is a ramp deck, but even though we've only got one-ofs of these guys, and a couple of other guys for that matter, a lot of one-ofs in the creature base if you didn't notice, we do have the 4 copies of Traverse the Ulvenwald in the spell base to help us get to these guys once we have Delirium. In the later game, Traverse can just go get any creature that we situationally need for whatever reason, and that helps us run all of that removal. You know, we cannot play 4 copies of Ulamog just because we have to get to him or we lose. Instead, we'll go down to 1, tutor him up when we need to, and dedicate those other 3 slots to removal. Really like the idea behind that. Just a little bit lower on the curve. Note all the 5-drops in this deck, by the way. There's Ishkana, Goblin Dark Dwellers, yay. As far as Dark Dwellers goes, this is another card that we'll see multiple times today, finally getting its place in the sun. And this pops up in aggro or in standard every now and again, but it's never really had the tenure in standard that I think a lot of us would have preferred that it gotten. You know, this isn't Snapcast or Mage or anything, obviously, but Goblin Dark Dwellers is such an obviously strong card that it's a little sad that it never really made it to the $5 or $6 mark. This is a very respectable creature right here that's going to recast, you know, any removal spell that we're running, even K-Return. This can recast like a little baby copy of K-Return, and that can be really nice for you too. Leave you with a 4/4 menace. Really hard to block. So, love Goblin Dark Dwellers, always have, made myself clear on that, and I know a lot of you do too. I like that it's actually getting some play. And Ishkana is just really good against small aggro decks. The deck actually gets Delirium relatively fast. You know, turn 5 it can have Delirium some of the times online, and Ishkana is great in those situations. If the game goes a little bit longer, you're more or less guaranteed at that point to have Ishkana fully powered, and getting those spiders can be really, really good in the aggro matchup. Or even when resolved against control, Ishkana is more than fine. They're yet another card that like forces them to sweep you or lose. And I'll reiterate, the only ramp spell in the deck are the 4 copies of Hour of Promise. So we're not ramping until turn 5, and there's really no way to get it on turn 4. You know, usually there'd be a way to play this 5-drop ramp spell earlier than turn 5, but not in this deck. We're just looking to cover the early game as much as possible with all of our removal, and even some smaller guys. You know, Walking Ballista as a creature and removal. Tireless Tracker can trade and get us a card or 2 sometimes, so we've got ways of covering the early game. But once we do get to Hour of Promise, we're guaranteed to play nearly any creature in our deck, and we do have a bunch of deserts in our deck we can go get to get those creatures in case we need them. Nicol Bolas is what makes this deck 4 colors. We've only got 1 blue source in the entire mana base that helps us cast this, but you know, we've got Hour of Promise to get that blue source. We've got Traverse the Ulvenwald to get that blue source. So it kind of amounts really to 9 blue sources in the deck, if you want to put it that way. So we've got plenty of sources to get to our Nicol, and when we do get to Nicol, we'll usually win, but you'll usually also end up boarding him out against really dedicated aggro, so there is that. But against most decks, when you play your Nicol, you're probably going to win. 7 to the dome is no joke. So let's take one more look at this list before we go on to the last deck here. Just love, again, the way this thing is built from a design perspective. This is a whole new take on ramp theory, and I love when we get to see that. Anytime that, like, you know, existing theory or existing sort of preconceived notions of how we build decks are challenged, I'm always a fan of that, and this looks to be an example of it. It's a 4-color deck in this format. That's tough to pull off. It's a 4-color ramp deck. That's cool too, you know. It plays a Nicol Bolas randomly. That's cool. It plays a bunch of one-ofs. Toolbox strategy with a ton of removal in a ramp deck. You just do not see this every day. Really, really unique take on ramp here, and I love that about it. But without further ado, the number 1 deck of the day, again, in no particular order. I just had to order them somehow. But probably the deck that, even though it's not my favorite deck from like a fun factor perspective, this is probably the deck that I would sleeve up if I was going to a competitive event anytime soon. I think this probably has better chops than nearly any deck we've looked at today, save for maybe 4-color ramp. But stop all the babbling. This right here is Black-Red Control. Now, this list is by Nathan Lothamer. This took 8th place at the Grand Prix in Minneapolis last weekend, and that's one of the best finishes we'll look at. You know, taking top 8ing at a Grand Prix is actually quite an achievement. So look out for this list, and that's another thing that would make it the deck that I'd sleeve up out of all 5 of these. Just check this out. This is yet another list in which Gifted Aetherborn and Kalitas are important additions. You know, this deck goes all the way, plays 3 Kalitas. That's a lot of Kalitas in this deck, but definitely worth it against the aggro matchup. And if you look at the deck as a whole, the entire thing is tuned for the aggro matchup. Literally, every single card in this deck is good against aggro. Now, I've already talked about Aetherborn and Kalitas at length here, and I've also talked about Goblin Dark Dwellers, but I'll say a little bit more about it here. Goblin Dark Dwellers is just a huge body. You know, it can come down on turn 5, block for us if we need to, or it can close the gap with Menace against those aggro decks too. It'll always recast a low-end removal spell, so it's essentially a 2-for-1, just fan-freaking-tastic card Goblin Dark Dwellers is right now, and I love, again, that it's seeing some play in this format. Considering that mid-range is usually the deck that beats aggro, Goblin Dark Dwellers is the perfect card for it right now, you know? Top of the curve, 5 mana, 4/4 that gets through a lot of the time, or can block and survive, killing dudes, and kills a dude when it comes into play. What more could you want against aggro? Goblin Dark Dwellers just stacked right now. Aside from that, though, it runs Silver Bullet copies of Glorybringer and the Scorpion God in the main deck. Glorybringer is just an anti-everything card. You know, it's good against aggro, good against control when resolved. Go ahead and start swinging as soon as it hits the battlefield. Evasive creature, you know. Decent against mid-range, kills a lot of the stuff in their decks, and gets through on the first turn that it's played. Just really fantastic card right now, but I think Goblin Dark Dwellers probably is the better 5-drop, so I'm not surprised that both of these are just one-ofs. But with that in mind, Scorpion God looks pretty sweet in the aggro matchup too. You know, pops and kills 1 toughness creatures, drawing you cards. That seems pretty sweet. Can even just whittle down bigger creatures, you know, and can eventually even finish off a Hazoret, given enough mana, and draw you cards the whole time. So just looks pretty darn good to me. Scorpion God may actually have a place in an aggro-dominated format, especially given the fact that it keeps coming back if they manage to kill it somehow. The Planeswalkers are strong in this one too, you know, plays 3 Chandra and a whole playset of Liliana, because again, can't stress enough how good Liliana is. You know, she comes down early, kills 80% of the creatures in the mono red aggro deck, and a lot of creatures in other aggro decks too, and she brings your dudes back, helping you win Wars of Attrition. Just, what else could you want, man? Liliana is just super well positioned right now, even though it's only her, you know, last 6 or 7 weeks in the format. She's very good at present. Same thing with Chandra, you know, comes down turn 4 some of the time, blows away a guy, or can get its card advantage against control, just does everything, you know, ramps us if we need it to, you know. Let's say we don't get that 5th land so that we can play something like Glorybringer or Dark Dwellers on the next turn. Well, not to worry, we can play those double red 5-drops easily if we drop a Chandra on turn 4, so lots of applications for her too. But here's the deck one more time. Let me look at the list with you. Again, every single main deck card is tuned to deal with aggro in some way, shape, or form, you know. As far as the entire creature base, Aetherborn and Kalitas are good against aggro. Glorybringer, all the 5-drops, you know, Glorybringer, Dark Dweller, Scorpion God, all good against aggro. Our Planeswalkers, good against aggro. Our spells are all removal spells, so literally every non-land card in the main deck is tuned to kill creature-based decks. Love that. They really went all the way with this list, and I probably would sleeve it up. It looks like a lot of fun. Not only is the entire deck, you know, tuned to deal with the really fast aggro in the format, but it doesn't look like it sacrifices that much in the way of power or end game. You know, we're playing a bunch of huge dudes and some really impactful planeswalkers, so we do have a good path to the end of the game here too. But I think we finally made it. This is probably at least a half-hour video. Sorry about that. But just wanted to take one last look at this format and, you know, kind of steer away from all the boring stuff that we've not only already seen a bunch of, but we'll probably continue to see a lot of. You know, Kaladesh will still be in the format after rotation, meaning that Mardu aggro might still be a thing. You know, Mardu vehicles are still in the format. You know, a license is still in the format. We'll have to wait and see. But I think Mardu might still be a strategy. Mono Red loses a couple of one-drops, but still keeps a lot of its pieces. Mono Black Zombies is probably DOA, so we might not have to worry about that anymore. But even Green-Black, you know, the Constrictor decks, they don't lose a whole lot to rotation either. So I think it's entirely possible that we'll continue to see these decks that we've already seen a lot of. And I just didn't want to focus on those. They were a little old hat at this point. I wanted to focus instead on celebrating what I think are the coolest decks in the entire format and just go out with a bang in that way. So let me know how you felt about all of these decks today. If there's anything I missed that's really awesome right now that you wanted to see covered, then let me know in the comments. There's a cool discussion here. But after that super long-winded video, I think I'm finally tapped out, you guys. Do all the YouTube stuff. Like the video if you like the video. Click all the links in the description. Check out these decks on TCG Player because they're a sponsor, and it helps the channel out when you just click on those links. Help me out by doing that. If you want to, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/SBMTG, or you can follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev. In the meantime, I am Dev from that place. I'll see you guys later. Thanks for watching, my wizards.